So, America, land of the free, home of the brave. And, for a very brief but extremely dramatic stretch of time, two countries trying to kill each other. How did this happen? Well, it's actually pretty simple. You see, America had a problem. Slavery, plus money, plus pride, plus a guy named Lincoln, equaled explosion. And that problem had been building for a very long time. When the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution in 1787, they did what any reasonable group of adults does when faced with a deeply uncomfortable subject at the dinner table. They ignored it. Now, slavery had existed in America since the colonial days. In the South, rich plantation owners had built their entire economy on it. Cotton, tobacco, sugar, all harvested by enslaved black people, who received in return absolutely nothing, except suffering. The South loved this system because it made them extraordinarily rich. The North, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly industrial. Factories, cities, wage, labor. And while the North was far from a moral utopia, let's be clear, a growing number of Northerners were starting to say, hey, maybe the slavery thing is bad. As America expanded westward, a very important question kept coming up. Should the new states allow slavery? The North said no, the South said absolutely yes. And Congress, in the grand tradition of people who don't want to deal with their problems, kept making compromises. First came the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Missouri, slave state; Maine, free state. Everyone draws a line on a map and agrees to chill. It held together for about 30 years. Then came Kansas, and Kansas was a disaster. Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which basically said, hey, new territories, you decide for yourselves, which sounds democratic and reasonable until you realize what immediately happened. Pro-slavery settlers and anti-slavery settlers both raced into Kansas from opposite directions. They crashed into each other, and everything exploded. Kansas erupted into a miniature civil war. Fistfights, raids, murders. People were calling it Bleeding Kansas because it was literally bleeding. The country wasn't just divided anymore, it was starting to break. And then, in 1860, the South's worst nightmare happened. Abraham Lincoln, lawyer, former congressman, and owner of what historians agree were extremely prominent cheekbones, won the presidential election. Now, Lincoln hadn't even campaigned in most southern states. He wasn't on the ballot in 10 of them, and he won anyway. The South saw this as the beginning of the end for their way of life. And they weren't entirely wrong. Lincoln was against slavery expanding further, so they did what anyone does when they don't get the election result they wanted. They left. South Carolina went first, then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. And together, they formed a brand new country, the Confederate States of America. President, Jefferson Davis. Capital, Montgomery, Alabama. Motto, essentially, we'd like to keep doing the thing. So, now America had two governments, two presidents, two flags, and one enormous burning question. Was anyone actually going to do something about this? Lincoln certainly had some thoughts, and those thoughts involved keeping the United States together by whatever means necessary. But here's the thing about two countries sharing the same land. Eventually, someone blinks. Eventually, someone does something they cannot take back. And in April of 1861, at a small fort sitting in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, someone did exactly that. A single cannon shot. That's all it took. One decision, made in the early hours of the morning, that would drag 600,000 people to their deaths and tear a nation in half for 4 brutal years. Fort Sumter was about to change everything. America had split itself in two. The South had stormed off, formed their own country, and elected Jefferson Davis as president. Lincoln was in the White House, furious and determined. And someone, somewhere in South Carolina, was about to make a very bad decision. That someone was Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard. And his bad decision was firing cannons at a U.S. military fort. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter. The Union garrison inside, outnumbered and running out of food, held on for 34 hours before surrendering. Nobody died in the bombardment, which was lucky, because that was about to change in a very dramatic way. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. The South called this an act of tyranny. 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, said, "That's it, we're out," and joined the Confederacy. And just like that, the Civil War had begun. Now, here's the thing about the Civil War that both sides got catastrophically wrong. Everyone thought it would be short. The South thought the North would give up quickly. The North thought the South would fold under pressure. They were both, to put it diplomatically, completely wrong. The first major battle happened in July 1861 at a place called Bull Run in Virginia. Wealthy Washington socialites actually packed picnic lunches and rode out to watch what they assumed would be a quick, clean Union victory. It was not a quick, clean Union victory. The Union Army was routed. Soldiers and socialites fled back to Washington in a panicked, tangled mess. The picnic baskets were abandoned. Nobody ate their sandwiches. Lincoln realized he needed a real general. He went through several. George McClellan, who was brilliant at organizing an army and absolutely terrified of actually using it. Then others. Each one either too slow, too cautious, or too something. Lincoln was losing patience fast. Meanwhile, the war was spreading. West, east, rivers, coastlines, and it was getting bloodier by the month. In April 1862, the Battle of Shiloh lasted 2 days and produced more casualties than all of America's previous wars combined. People back home read the numbers and went pale. This was not what anyone had signed up for. But Lincoln had an idea, a big one. On January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. Now, technically, the Confederacy ignored this completely, since they didn't recognize Lincoln's authority. But it changed the entire meaning of the war. The Union wasn't just fighting to preserve the country anymore, it was fighting to end slavery, and that mattered enormously to the world, to history, and to the nearly 200,000 black soldiers who would go on to fight for the Union. Lincoln also finally found his general, Ulysses S. Grant, a man who was rumpled, quiet, and completely désolé, unbothered by the idea of fighting. Grant didn't retreat. Grant didn't hesitate. Grant just kept moving forward, and he ground the Confederate Army down like a slow, unstoppable machine. In the East, Grant went head-to-head with the Confederacy's best general, Robert E. Lee, a man so respected that the Union had actually offered him command of their armies first. Lee had declined, chosen Virginia, and proceeded to embarrass Union General after Union General for 3 straight years. But Grant was different. Even when Lee hit him hard, Grant just shifted and kept pressing. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," Grant said, and he meant it. The summer of 1864 was brutal. Enormous battles, staggering losses on both sides. The Confederacy was being squeezed from every direction. Sherman marched through Georgia, burning and cutting a path to the sea, destroying the South's ability to supply its own army. Grant kept hammering Lee in Virginia. The Confederacy was running out of men, food, and options. On April 9, 1865, at a small courthouse in a Virginia town called Appomattox, Robert E. Lee sat down across from Ulysses S. Grant and surrendered. The war was over. 620,000 dead. The bloodiest conflict in American history, fought on American soil by Americans against Americans. The 13th Amendment was ratified later that year, abolishing slavery permanently and constitutionally throughout the entire United States. It was, without question, the right outcome. It came at an almost unimaginable cost. And Lincoln, the man who had held the country together through 4 years of catastrophic war, who had issued the Emancipation Proclamation and refused to quit, went to the theater on April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender. He did not come home. John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer who had watched the South lose everything, shot Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington. Lincoln died. The following morning, the nation that had just survived a civil war now had to grieve its president. Andrew Johnson took over. Reconstruction began, the enormous, complicated, painful process of bringing the South back into the Union and figuring out what freedom actually meant for 4 million formerly enslaved people. It was handled badly, then worse, then abandoned entirely by 1877, leaving a legacy of inequality and injustice that America is, frankly, still reckoning with today. So, what do we take from all of this? America fought the bloodiest war in its history over a question it had been too cowardly to answer at its founding. It took 4 years, 600,000 lives, and one president's assassination to finally settle it. The Union survived, slavery ended, and the country that emerged from the smoke was fundamentally, permanently changed. Whether it changed enough is a question worth sitting with. That's the American Civil War. If you made it to the end of both parts, thank you genuinely for watching. If this is the kind of history content you're here for, subscribe. There's a lot more coming. Drop a comment telling me which conflict you want covered next, because trust me, history does not run out of disasters to explain. I'll see you in the next one.